Okay, good morning, church family. It is good to see you all this morning, and I want to again welcome those worshiping online to the Southside Church of Christ. As always, it's good for me to be here this morning. I hope it is also good for you to be here, that you are blessed and encouraged by our time together, and that we're able to take what we learned this morning and apply it to our lives in meaningful ways. I want to again make the announcement that we are beginning our Wednesday night worship services again, starting at 6 o'clock here at the building. So if you can be here for that, if you are comfortable coming for that, then we would love to have you for that. We're just taking it week by week, seeing how it goes. But again, do please keep us and many churches around the world in your prayers as we continue to figure out how best to navigate this very unorthodox situation we have found ourselves in. David versus Goliath. Just by saying those two names, I assume that most of us, if not all of us in here, know exactly who and what I am talking about. It's a story that we all know. We've hopefully all heard it before, and if we haven't heard the specific story, hopefully we can change that this morning, but at least you know of the base concept, right? What that means, what it represents, what it symbolizes. David versus Goliath. That is synonymous with basically underdog stories, right? Rooting for the little guy against some great oppressive force. Whether it's the little guy versus the big guy, or it's the rebels versus the empire, or it's the rookie versus the champ, whatever it is, it's the underdog versus the great big force that they realistically should not be able to overcome. And as we hear these David versus Goliath stories, we hear them, we read about them, however we soak them in, however we interpret them, there are many different kinds of feelings that we can get from hearing these great epic stories. Usually we hear or we feel like inspired, we feel inspiration coming from these stories of the little guy taking on the champ. We may feel motivated. We might feel motivation to get out there and face our own Goliaths in our lives. Or maybe we feel encouragement, knowing that what we are going through, others are going through as well, that we are not alone in facing our struggles, and we are encouraged knowing that others have been able to persevere and get through them as well. We are impressed by the feats that are accomplished in these stories. They inspire and motivate us to do better. We are inspired by David's ability to overcome adversity. We are motivated to again face our own obstacles and challenges in life. And we are encouraged to persevere no matter how difficult things may seem. Now, those of us who grew up in the church hearing the story of David and Goliath, we draw similar meanings from these stories, I believe. You know, we're so used to hearing about them. But I believe to a secular audience, there are some different interpretations that are drawn from the story of David and Goliath. See, to them, the stories are more about the people overcoming the adversity, overcoming those great obstacles. It's about our strength, the individual strength, the person's strength. The little guy who again has no right to be where he is, standing up to and through his own might, taking down the champion. It's about what we as people can do and what we as people can accomplish. And that gives hope to a secular world. You know, these stories, they look at the world, the people, the individuals in them, and they say, you can do it. You have that power, you individual, you person, you human being. But I have to ask this morning, is that really the point of the original story? Is that really what we as Christians are drawing from the story of David and Goliath specifically? I'd like for us to go back to the source this morning and kind of discover what exactly is being said to us in the text, in that story of David and Goliath. And ask the question, is it about David overcoming Goliath, or is it about God overcoming Goliath? I'd like for us to go back to the text this morning and find out. That's 1 Samuel chapter 17. That's where our key text is going to be this morning, if you'd like to turn there. 1 Samuel chapter 17. The story begins there. It is the Israelites versus the Philistines. All right, the Israelites are God's chosen people. They are led by King Saul, Israel's first king. And then we have the Philistines, who are the attacking enemy. They are laying siege to Israel. They are a great, numerous enemy. Israel is on one mountain, the Philistines are on another, and there's a great valley in between them where the battle would be taking place. The stage is set for an epic confrontation between these two great forces, the people of God and the opposing army, the opposing force there coming in to meet each other at the heat of battle. But that's not how the story goes, per se. You see, before any fighting actually starts between the armies, we enter Goliath from the Philistine side, from the opposing team. He is the Philistines' champion. He basically represents their nation. He challenges Israel to single-man combat. He says, I'll represent my army, you represent your army, we'll duke it out, and whoever wins our individual fight will win this war. And Goliath was not somebody that we would want to tangle with one-on-one. Goliath stood an astonishing 9 feet 9 inches tall. He was coated in armor and weapons all over his person. His sheer spectacle, just looking at him, was enough to deter even the bravest of Israel's warriors. See, Israel, again, when they were initially beginning to take the promised land of Canaan, they came in, the spies said, we can't take these people, they're too big for us. If they had trouble back then, I can only imagine how much more troublesome Goliath would have been for them, completely weaponized and ready to take them on in solo combat. They've never faced a monster quite like Goliath. But before he even has a chance to lay a finger on anybody from Israel, he first has to demoralize them. The first strategy that Goliath has in his version of warfare is trash-talking his opponents. Let's start there in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Beginning in verse 8, we'll read verses 8 through 11. Then he being Goliath, stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Goliath sets the terms for Israel. Says, send your greatest warrior to fight me one-on-one. If you win, then we'll be your servants. But if I win, then you will be our servants and serve us. And he says this confidently because he knows they have no man that can take him on. Israel has no human being who can take on Goliath. Maybe 5 or 10 men if they could all gang up on him, but one man individually does not stand a chance against this warrior. And so he then begins to defy Israel. It wasn't bad enough to issue this impossible challenge that they cannot win, but then he begins to deconstruct them verbally, not only insulting their king and their nation and their people, but by defying Israel, he has defied God. He is basically issuing a challenge to Jehovah God, saying, you and your armies, your people, are nothing in the face of my physical might. And despite that, despite not just their nation, their people, but their God being called out like that, Saul is too afraid. His men, his warriors, are too afraid to do anything to Goliath, because their fear of that man is greater than their faith in God. It's at this point in the story that we are reintroduced to David. David has been anointed as the next king of Israel to succeed Saul, chosen by God himself. He is the youngest of Jesse's sons, and his brothers, the rest of Jesse's children, are off fighting in this war against the Philistines. They are being held up by Goliath, whereas David is back with his father watching the sheep in the pasture. already symbolizing the man after God's own heart he would go on to be, watching over the flock of sheep just as God, our good shepherd, watches over us. And so Jesse, David's father, sends David off to the battlefront there to bring food and supplies to his brothers. And so when David arrives and he meets his brothers, are greeting and talking there, David then overhears off in the distance this great big man yelling insults at Israel. And this angers David. He hears what Goliath is saying, and he is upset that Israel is allowing this to happen. David says, "Who is this Philistine that he should speak and defy the armies of the living God?" No one else wants to take on Goliath. They're all too scared. But David is not. And David marches right into Saul's tent there and demands to fight Goliath himself. Picking up there, 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verses 31. We'll read verses 31 through 37. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So David convinces Saul to let him go and fight Goliath. And David uses examples from his time as a shepherd to convince Saul that he can do this. But that's not what sways Saul. It's not David's experience as a shepherd or as someone who has bested these animals that convinces Saul to let David fight. Because Saul knows that this little kid David is no match for this 10-foot-tall monster that's throwing insults at God. David and Saul both know that David himself is no match for Goliath. But again, that's not what convinces Saul. What convinces Saul is David's faith in God. Reading verse 37 again, David says, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, not because of your great feats, not because of your great strength, not your power, but the Lord be with you." David delivered his sheep, his flock, from these wild animals, and God delivered him from those wild animals. And now God will deliver his flock in a greater sense from this Philistine beast. And I'm sure we all know the story from this point on. David takes 5 smooth stones and his sling, and he goes to face Goliath. But Goliath isn't done trash talking just yet. Picking up into verse 43 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. "So the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field.' Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands.'" And that's exactly what happened. David slung his stone, struck Goliath, took Goliath's sword, and decapitated him, winning the fight for Israel and conquering the Philistines. And despite the story's grand and epic and fantastical nature, it's still very applicable for us today. You know, Goliath represents a stand-in for the obstacles that we face in our lives. Goliath is the world, full of fear and intimidation. He's overly flashy and superficially intimidating. He's bigger than we are, nastier than we are, much meaner than we are. And he uses all of that to put on a show of intimidation, to beat us into submission without ever having to actually strike a blow. He is intimidation through excess. And so that's Goliath, but David represents a stand-in for us, for people, for humans, you know. We are small, we are weak, we are hilariously and hopelessly outmatched and outgunned against everything Goliath has to offer. We're not intimidating, we're not fierce, we're not flashy, we're at the mercy of the world. And on a surface level, Goliath should have easily won that fight. If you run the numbers, Goliath wins 10 out of 10 times. He had every advantage over David, except for the one advantage that actually mattered. And in the end, Goliath was no match for God. And that is what matters, that David was on God's side in this fight. See, all of that stuff of the world, it didn't save Goliath. He had all the size, all the mass, all the armor, all the weapons, all the wit and sarcasm and knowledge that he needed to win that fight. But because his faith was placed in himself, in his stuff, in his things, he failed. Because his faith was not in God. All of that stuff did him no good. His faith was placed in himself and his might and his things, and it was misplaced. Whereas David, on the other hand, he had every right to fear Goliath. Like we mentioned, Goliath had all the advantages. He was bigger, meaner, nastier. He could and should have easily won that fight. But despite all that, David did not fear Goliath. And even if he did, his fear of Goliath was not greater than his faith in God. You see, David didn't win that fight. David didn't save Israel. David knew he couldn't take Goliath physically. He knew he was smaller and weaker, but David's faith was not in himself. David didn't believe in what David could do. David believed in what God could do. And it was that faith that saw him through to save Israel. Just like with the lion and the bear, God delivered David from the hand of Goliath. Goliath could have easily killed David by himself, but Goliath had no chance against God. And David was on God's side. And so what did David have to fear if God had already won? You see, God is above all of the things of this world. This world is limited. It is finite. It is going to come to an end. No matter how grand you build yourself up with the things of this world, it is all going to come to an end. But God is limitless. He is eternal. He is greater, and He will never end. The world and the stuff of the world is created, but God is the creator, which by definition makes Him greater than anything in this world. And in this world, we are David facing our Goliaths, whether that's temptation and sin, or fears and doubts, or natural disasters and illnesses, or false teachers and secular enemies. You know, whatever it is, we are facing our own obstacles, our own Goliaths in our lives. And this story is not some ancient, outdated myth with no connection to us in the present day. It's not some archaic story that we cannot relate to. We can relate to it. David versus Goliath is just as relevant today as it was when it happened. As Paul says in Romans 8:31, "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us?" The question Paul asks here is, of course, rhetorical. Now, he's not literally asking, find me someone who can stand up to God. He knows no one can. That's the point. No one can stand up to God. And so if we're on God's side, what do we have to fear? What could possibly get in our way that could deter us from living as Christians should? If we're on God's side, we have no one and nothing to fear. And that is the peace that comes from being in Jesus Christ. It's not peace and comfort in a physical sense, finding peace and comfort in the things of this life. It's finding peace and knowing that no matter what happens in this life, we are invested in something greater, something better than anything this life has to offer. It's the peace that we are saved and that God is in control. Because our faith is not on the things of this world, it is on things above, on spiritual things. Not this crude physical matter, but on things that are spiritual and eternal. If God is for us, who can be against us? Goliath? He's dead, perished, reduced to dust. He is nothing despite all that he had to boast for. Who could be against us? Men? Goliath was a man. Men are finite. They have a shelf life. They are not going to last. They are of this world. Men fade. Men perish. Who can be against us? Satan? He's already lost. He's already lost the war. He does what he can over this physical world, but in the end, he is going to lose. Just like all that he has control over, he is going to perish as well. What does matter is the spiritual, eternal nature with which we live our lives. That is God, and God has already won this fight. And just like God delivered David from the lion, the bear, and from Goliath, he will deliver us from the evil of this world and usher us into the glorious age that is to come. And maybe you're here this morning seeking that peace and comfort that only comes from being in Jesus Christ. To put your faith in him, not in you, not in yourself, not in all the things that you have and all the things that you can do, but put your faith in the one who made this world and who made you. Or maybe you're here for reasons unrelated to anything that was said this morning. You're just seeking the prayers of the church. That I would implore you to come forward and be surrounded by people who know you and love you and want what is best for you. And as always, there is nothing better for anyone's life than to make Jesus Christ their life. But if you have any this morning, be it great or small, won't you please come as we stand and sing our invitation song.